Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Mamata Banerjee's response to Tapas Pal's episode has dismayed many of her supporters and admirers. They now feel that on critical issues like rape, criticism of the government in cartoons or tough questions by students, she seems to take a position on the wrong side of the argument. So has Mamata Banerjee disappointed and disillusioned middle-class India? That's the debate in part 2. But first, the worrying news from Iraq about both the construction workers held in captivity in Mosul and the nurses who've been forcibly moved from Tikrit. Have the workers been press-ganged into forced manual labor? Are the nurses at the mercy of armed ISIS fighters? In our first discussion tonight, we try and shed light on this worrying situation. Now, joining me to talk about the distressing news from Iraq is the Strategic Affairs Editor of The Hindu, Praveen Swami, who has in fact just returned from that country this morning, the former Deputy National Security Advisor, Leela Ponnappa, the Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and India's former Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman and the United Arab Emirates, Talmiz Ahmed. Praveen Swami, let's start with the distressing news about the nurses which broke this afternoon. We know that they've been taken away from their hospital in Tikrit by bus. We believe they're being taken towards Mosul. We believe that they're in the captivity of ISIS. Can you assess for me what degree of danger you believe they are in?
Well, there's obviously danger to the extent that they're in the middle of a war zone. And as foreigners lost in an extremely dangerous part of the world, there's obviously considerable risk to them. Having said that, Mosul is relatively stable, is quite a distance from the front line, and unlike Tikrit, is not under assault by Iraqi forces. My guess would be, based on what Kurdish military sources have been telling The Hindu, that this was in the nature of an evacuation, rather than something where harm is intended to come the nurses' way by ISIS.
I want to pick up on that last sentence. When you say Kurdish sources have been telling The Hindu that this is in the nature of an evacuation, are you suggesting that your paper has been told that in fact the nurses are being taken away from the hospital in Tikrit, possibly to Mosul, for their own safety and for their own good? Let me start with the caveat that all of this is at best in the nature of speculation. Information in a situation as chaotic and war-torn as Iraq is today is at best of limited value. But yes, the nurses were in great danger in Tikrit. There was fighting going around the hospital, bombs going off. And their captors, who include not just ISIS but also elements of ousted dictator Saddam Hussein's regime, knew they would be held to account for their safety, and likely believed that safety would be easier to assure in Mosul in the north, where no fighting has been going on. Now, Leela Ponnappa, as a former Deputy National Security Advisor, what's your opinion? Have the nurses been taken away and kidnapped? Or are they in fact under some form of protection? One of the things that in fact the spokesman of the EMA, Saeed Akbaruddin, made a point when he held his press conference today of saying is that the nurses have been moved for reasons of their own safety. Do you accept that, or do you think that perhaps this is not the full truth?
I'd start by repeating what Praveen just said, Karan, namely that anything we say is speculative. So if I really wouldn't care to express an opinion, but let me give you an assessment. At best, they have been moved for their own protection because this is a war zone. The Iraqi army is reportedly making headway towards Tikrit, and therefore this was in the nature of an evacuation for their safety. The worst case, of course, is that they have been held as hostages, but I think that is something that we should be careful about because there has been no ransom demand. There have been no attempts to contact the Indian Embassy or the Government of India, to the best of my knowledge. And this is a war zone, so there is a risk, there is a danger. I'm told that when they were asked to move to Mosul, and they said they would rather not, they were told that if they'd stay, then the hospital building where they were would be blown up. Now, whether this was in the nature of a threat or in the nature of an ultimatum, or frankly a clear recognition of the warlike situation around, in terms of whether it was the ISIS or the Iraqi army who would do the bombardment, that remains to be seen. So I think there's a best case and there is a worst case, and let us hope for the best case in the absence of indicators that they have been held hostage.
Tarmiz Ahmed is someone who served long tenures in countries around Iraq as ambassador, in Oman, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates. How much reassurance can we draw from the fact that television has reported that the Indian nurses are not the only ones? There are also allegedly 5 Bangladeshi nurses as well. That this is therefore possibly not an India-specific action. It's something that's happening to a whole range of other people at the same time. How much comfort or reassurance can we draw from that fact?
No, we have to take into account the fact that Indians are not the only foreign nationals working in that country. There are bound to be numerous other foreign nationals. They are all caught in the war trap. I personally believe that the nurses have been taken away for their own safety. You know that Tikrit has been assaulted and is being repeatedly under bombardment and firepower. It is a prestigious target as well. It is very, very close to the capital. It is also associated with the former ruler of the country. So I'm not surprised at all. And if you recall the earlier news reports, there was a neighboring hospital that had been hit, and therefore I think there has been a certain degree of care as far as our own nationals are concerned.
The interesting thing, Pramipal Chaudhary, is all 3 of my guests so far in one way or another believe that the nurses have been either evacuated or taken away for their own protection and their own security. Now, one of the things that has emerged is that they were in touch with their families earlier today.
Right.
The MEA has said that even after they began being moved by bus, the MEA was in touch with them.
Yes.
Mr. Akbaruddin revealed that in fact the embassy had been in touch with the nurses 10 minutes before his press conference, although he has separately told me that there's no phone contact after 6 p.m. Indian time. But the fact that they've been in touch with several people at several times today, is that reason for reassurance? Because presumably if they're being kidnapped, then the kidnappers wouldn't allow them to make contact with the world and tell them where they are.
Well, I think yes. I think there's a bit of combination. The argument that they're being moved for safety and that they are being coerced are not mutually exclusive here. I think they not only, I don't think they, so far ISIS doesn't seem to have indicated any interest in harming them, and as you said, they're clearly not following the normal pattern of somebody who wants to do ransom or kidnapping. But I think you have to keep in mind that in a war zone, nurses are actually very useful. And I think that one of the reasons why they are not allowing the nurses, for example, to move to the Kurdish area, I believe one of the ideas was to move them to Erbil, which is a Kurdish area and therefore outside of the war zone, is that nurses are useful for people who are fighting. So yes, you move them to safety because you're not interested in them getting harmed, but you also don't want to give them up, because if you're going to have a stream of wounded guerrilla fighters coming in over the next few weeks, having 40 or 50 nurses is actually very useful for you. And I don't think they want to give them up either.
Praveen Swami is someone who was recently in Mosul, someone who's been in Kirkuk and Erbil. Do you believe that in fact the nurses are being taken because they are needed to act as nurses for the ISIS injured and possibly badly injured? That they are therefore being taken for a purpose and not just for their protection and safety?
That's entirely possible. Mosul has been terribly short, I'd reported some days earlier, terribly short of doctors, medical supplies, not to mention food, fuel, electricity. And there is a battle going on. There are injured ISIS and ISIS fighters and fighters from other groups. As we've seen, the Indians already trapped in Mosul seem to have been put to work digging defensive fortifications and earthworks for ISIS. It should also be pointed out that there is no easy way out of the city right now. There was a highway running to Erbil, a good highway, but that highway has been severed and defensive bunds have been erected. So it's not as if there's some easy way of getting 40 or 50 people out of there in the first place. My guess is that there are various channels of communications Kurdish authorities and others have with people in Mosul. Those do not seem to have been very, very successful in the case of the Indian laborers already trapped there. I'm guessing there will be no immediate resolution of calls for the nurses to be allowed to leave through Mosul. This will probably take some time.
Leela Punappa, one of the concerns, and it's not just journalists who are skeptical who have this concern, many watching and therefore worried because these are relatives and friends, wonder whether the government is giving the full truth, whether in fact the government is minimizing the danger and minimizing the risks the nurses run. As someone who's worked in government, do you get a sense of confidence from the briefings that the full truth is being told to us, or do you suspect that understandably some things are being necessarily held in reserve?
Absolutely, and I don't think the government should do everything in full display or over the media, because to the extent that there can be contact with any credible interlocutors, mediators, people who can help, it has to be done quietly, it has to be done without the glare of publicity and without the persistent pressure of minute-to-minute coverage. Because I think right now, as far as the ISIS is concerned, I mean, they are in the middle of a military operation. And as Pramit and Praveen have both mentioned, it makes sense to have nurses. I mean, even in a normal flight, for example, if there's an emergency, there's a call out for a doctor, and the nearest doctor is press ganged into helping out in a situation. What better would the ISIS do in a situation of war, where you have casualties coming in? So hopefully they are unharmed, but I think it is to be expected that in this situation, whether they are nurses, whether they are laborers, as the other group of 39 is, they will be put to work. But let us hope that they remain unharmed. Right now, I think anything we say is speculative, and I really do believe it has to be handled quietly.
Talmiz Ahmed, does the Indian embassy in Baghdad, does the Foreign Office in Delhi have contacts that reach up to ISIS in some shape or form? Do we have contacts that reach to elements of the Saddam regime that may be supporting ISIS, or elements of the Sunni tribes that are perhaps involved in fighting alongside ISIS? In other words, do we have ways of reaching the people, or reaching people around the people who have taken the nurses into custody?
The main point that we have been making on your earlier programs is that ISIS is not a monolithic entity. It is made up of a very wide disparate group. The most important element of ISIS are the tribal chiefs. And there is, I think they are about 50 to 60,000 and even more. They are the backbone of the fighting force. You also have Ba'athist soldiers, you have soldiers from the Naqshbandiya order, and you have a variety of Islamic groups that are not as radical as the jihadis. The jihadis themselves are about 5 to 6,000. We have access to people who are involved in this coalition. We've had access to them earlier. We have access to them now. And I would be I would be completely confident in the fact that our team that is presently in Baghdad would be seeking contact with them. There are also religious scholars who can be extremely helpful in moderating the situation and giving us access where it is required. The main situation now is that you cannot depend entirely on the Iraqi government because they are at war. These are people hostile to them. But in this situation, as we had about 10 years ago, in this situation, the team does have access to people outside government who could play an influential role. Having said this, we must be clear, we cannot guarantee success.
Absolutely.
We can only guarantee the maximum effort.
Absolutely, that's very true. But picking up from what you've heard from Talmiz Ahmed, what do you think would be the mood in the MEA today? Would they be worried? Would they be reasonably sanguine that the nurses are safe? Or is there in fact a greater degree of assurance which they don't want to share with us because they don't want to give good news until they can confirm it? Where do you think on that spectrum the emotions in the MEA stand today?
I don't think they'd be completely horrified or believe that they have no chance of success, but they would definitely be nervous because while there are many players involved, and some of them we definitely do have contact with, it's simply too chaotic for anybody to be absolutely certain that they could get the right people to be able to spring them at the right moment. And the point is that it's going to be a war zone. You're going to start to see Iraq probably will start putting together some sort of a sustained fight. The Kurds may join in at some later front if they start to feel that they could capture bits and pieces of territory. And in a war zone like that, absolutely no guarantees can be given, no matter how many people you know and how friendly you are to all players, that you're going to be able to get people out of safety.
So we have to keep our fingers crossed.
I would say so, and I think the construction workers are going to be particularly vulnerable because they will continue to be at the war front, because they will be needed for work there.
Absolutely. I want to in fact move on to the construction workers at this point. Praveen Swami, writing in your paper, The Hindu today, you write that a senior Kurdish security official has told you that the 39 Indian construction workers trapped in Mosul have been press ganged to build earthworks and defensive fortifications in various locations in the city's Sunni-dominated quarter. Without asking you to reveal your sources, how sure are you of this information? Is it speculative, or do you have a feeling that this is actually the truth?
It tallies broadly, Karan, with what Kurdish refugees coming out of the area had also been saying. Various people had seen, you will recall The Hindu had reported about a week ago, we'd reported that refugees leaving Mosul had said they'd seen Indians or people who looked South Asian, people who looked Indian, engaged in various kinds of earthworks and so on and so forth. This does seem to be broadly credible. Having said that, there is obviously no way I or anyone else can independently verify this. And sadly, there's been no communication between the individuals and their families, which again makes it very, very difficult to get a clear picture of exactly what's happening.
But one thing that I did pick up from your article in The Hindu this morning was that in fact the Indians are not the only construction workers in this particular position or predicament. You seem to suggest that there were other South Asians who are involved in similar press ganging forced labor. Does that mean that there are Bangladeshis and Pakistanis who've been pressed into building earthworks and defensive fortifications?
Possibly, and we have no idea what the numbers are because there was no effective system of registration for any of these nationalities. Large numbers of South Asians, particularly Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, fled towards Erbil and safety in the first couple of days after the ISIS attack. That's around June 9th or 10th. But all those who didn't flee with that first wave seem to have got more or less stuck inside Mosul. You know, on a front line where forces are on hair trigger, it's probably not a smart idea to try and sneak across.
Now, Leela Punappa, assuming that Praveen Swami's information is true, and I for one have absolutely no reason to doubt it whatsoever, we seem to have a very peculiar situation. On the one hand, the Indian construction workers are being used as forced labor. On the other hand, there's been no demand for their ransom, and Kurdish sources have told The Hindu that they're not being used as hostages either. And yet they're clearly in captivity, and they're clearly being made to work by force. How much danger would you assess these 39 construction workers are in?
Well, I think even at the best of times in this kind of a situation, they would be in danger, at least from crossfire. Given the nature of the hostilities, given the issues and the elements involved, Talmi spoke about the various groups that are involved. I think reason does not necessarily flow in such a situation. Your question earlier, Karan, about what would the mood in MEA or I would say anywhere in the government of India be? Even when an Indian national in peacetime is in trouble, I can assure you that a lot of stops are pulled out in order to try to resolve the situation. It doesn't always make the media, and much of this is unsung. But whether it is a case of a casualty, whether it's a case of an arrest, there's an enormous amount of work that goes into even tracking a single Indian national.
I accept that.
Now, 46 nurses, 39 laborers, there is concern. No, it isn't. All I would like to say is that very clearly this is a serious situation. And it's a national situation. You've got people from all over the country involved, and certainly I believe the effort would be to get them out. It is possible. Right now, even if they were released, they probably couldn't go anywhere.
Talmiz Ahmed, we know that ISIS has executed Iraqi military officials. We know that they've killed a large number of Shia and Christian Iraqis. How does ISIS view Sikhs and Hindus? Now, the MEA today, speaking about those 39 construction workers who are clearly in forced captivity, clearly being press ganged, if you can accept the Hindu report, into work that they don't want to do, has said that they are unharmed but in captivity. But what is the attitude of ISIS towards Hindus and Sikhs? Could it be anything similar to the way they treat Shias and Christians?
See, so far they have made no statement whatsoever about other religious groups. And I would not like to alarm my community in any way. Yes, this is a group of zealots. They seem to have a sectarian agenda and they are anti-Ba'athist. So they have killed people in the past. And they are anti-Shia and they are anti-government officials, part of the Iraqi army. They are also against certain other Sunni groups, the Sahwa, who had attacked them earlier some years ago and nearly destroyed them. Now, it is a very complicated situation. So far, they have made no remarks whatsoever about Hindu and Sikh communities, nor have they expressed any hostility whatsoever to these other groups. On the other hand, they are focusing on governance. If you see their statements, they are very conciliatory, they are very accommodative,
okay.
They want to project themselves as serious people, capable of governance. They are inviting professionals to come to their state so that they can contribute to the glory of their Islamic State.
Let me ask you this question. Are you more concerned about the safety of the 39 construction workers in Mosul who, as the Hindu reports, have been press ganged into forced labor? Or are you more worried about the nurses? Or is there no way of differentiating between the two?
I would, on the basis of what we know, be more worried about the workers. Because it's there, if you look at it in terms of what a military situation is, the nurses are essentially being pushed back deep behind the war zone area. And my sense would be, or my instinct would be, that they would be essentially asked to run the equivalent of a hospital where wounded men would be moved as the war progresses. But the construction workers are being put right on the front line. I mean, you don't build
defense
defensive fortifications except where you think the enemy is going to hit you. So in effect, they are caught between the two sides. And the fact that they've been cut off from all communication and are definitely being put out there to do things that the other Iraqis themselves do not seem to be prepared to do is a clear indication that they are in the line of fire. And I would be most concerned immediately about the fact what their fate is going to be when the fighting begins.
Praveen Swami, your article says that Kurdish officials believe there is no imminent prospect of Mosul being freed from ISIS control. But your article also reports that the city is peaceful, some shops and offices are functioning, communication services are supposedly functioning as well, and governance is in the hands of former Saddam regime officers. However, your article also at the same time says that ISIS has enforced a strict religious code on the streets of Mosul. From the standpoint of those construction workers who are press ganged into forced labor, is this a reassuring description of Mosul, or is it meaningless?
I'd be nervous being in the way of a war, Karan. Nothing can reassure someone who's stuck in the middle of a war and has absolutely no idea on how they might be able to get out. Having said that, I'd much rather someone was in, if I had a loved one, I would much rather they were in Mosul than in Tikrit. There is fighting going on in Tikrit. Mosul is still some distance away. There have been airstrikes 3 days ago outside the city, but there has been no actual fighting within the city. The Iraqi army has not, shall we say, has used the bluntest of instruments in Tikrit. There's been bombing inside civilian areas. There's been large-scale use of medium and heavy weapons. At least in Mosul, nothing of this is going on. It is a long journey. It's going to be a lot of fighting along the road north from Tikrit, headed towards Kirkuk, and on finally to Mosul before the Iraqi army makes it there, if it ever makes it there. And that at least gives the Indian government a little bit of time to work with Kurdish authorities on getting these people out. I should just add here that I'm a little less sanguine about Indian diplomacy than a couple of other people in this discussion. I think India did have excellent contacts on various sides of the fence at one point in time. but Iraq has changed profoundly these last couple of years, and it's very hard to tell who actually has power where on the ground. You may know Izzat al-Duri because he was someone important in the Saddam regime, but that doesn't necessarily mean India has any influence or say-so with the particular group who may be wielding power in a particular part of Mosul on a particular day. It's a chaotic and unpleasant situation, and I'm not sure counting on people who were influential at some point in the past is necessarily going to be very productive today.
Very quickly, because time is our enemy, Talmiz Ahmed, I want to draw your attention to the fact that ISIS has now declared itself to be an Islamic State. They've declared Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi the Caliph. And in his Ramzan speech, al-Baghdadi called on Muslims to take up arms against what he called the enemies of Allah. And he identified India as one of the many countries where Muslim rights are under threat. Does that new transformation heighten the danger of Indians in Tikrit, in Mosul, particularly in the war-torn zones, particularly those Indians who are Hindus, Sikhs and Christians and not Muslims?
Not immediately, no. ISIS does have a terrible record of killing people it believes are unbelievers. But those attacks have mostly been directed at Shia Muslims for the moment. I think this opens up a whole order of worry for India, especially with the prospect that some Indian jihadists might in the future head ISIS wards for training and the gathering of resources. But for the moment, ISIS has been respectful of foreigners in areas under its control. I don't think we should panic ourselves into an intemperate response. I think the government did that in the early days of this crisis, and I think some calm is probably still called for.
Talmiz Ahmed, as someone who's watching developments from Dubai and knows that region very well, do you share that assessment that in fact this transformation of ISIS into the Islamic State and the declaration of a caliphate doesn't hold out immediate heightened danger to Indians in the war-torn zone in Iraq? A quick answer, because time is against us.
I fully agree with that. These are very early days, but whatever statements I have seen, they are mostly constructive. They want to, they are interested in projecting their state in a positive light. Of course, time will tell as to whether they are able to live up to it. We can have our own doubts about that. As of now, I don't believe that they are going to do any communal killings.
All right, we're going to have to end this particular episode there. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me.